Hey climbers, and welcome to Chapter 5 of this Intro to Bouldering course. In this chapter, we're going to be covering strength and conditioning basics for new climbers. But before we jump into the exercises, there are a few topics that I want to make sure that we cover so that you're set up for success when you jump into the weight room. So the first concept to cover is going to be a minimum effective dose. So I'm going to pull up some charts here so that we can walk through this and kind of explain what it looks like. So on the bottom of the chart here, we have our work or our stimulus. And then on the y-axis, we have our gains. So a minimum effective dose is finding the right amount of work or stimulus to produce the desired results that we want. So this minimum effective dose is basically going to be getting away with the least amount of work that you can do while still getting gains. So it's a great way to think about training is the minimum effective dose needed to move towards your goal and then figure out if you want to move beyond that. The next part of this to talk about is your maximum recoverable volume. So on the other side of the spectrum here at the very top, we have the most amount of work that we can do and still recover and adapt from it. Anything that we exceed beyond this, while we still might be able to, produce effort and continue to do work, we're not going to be able to recover from this additional work that we're doing. So we're going to get a de-training effect. When we keep doing this, this is where we begin to risk injury in our training. So as new climbers or as any athlete in general, we want to make sure that we're always landing between our minimum effective dose and our maximum recoverable volume. So as a new climber, you might notice that you have a lower capacity than somebody at the top level in climbing. So what is capacity? Capacity is basically the amount of work that you can do in either a session or in a week of training and still recover. So if we look at these charts again, we'll see now at the top, you have an athlete who has a smaller work capacity, and then at the bottom, an athlete who has a much higher work capacity. This means that they can get more work done and still handle all that work and recover and get an effective growth stimulus from it and make gains. So for you as a new climber, you're likely to have much lower capacity than someone who is more advanced. So this means you have to be really strategic about the work that you do because you can only do a limited amount of work before you kind of push beyond the amount that you can recover from. The great thing about capacity is that capacity can grow as you get more and more fit in a sport. So now that we've kind of covered a few of these topics, it's time to talk a little bit more about capacity in general and how we spend our our allowance of effort in a gym each week. So the best way to talk about this is thinking about kind of like a currency. So let's say each week you're given $100 to spend on your efforts in training. And if you spend more than that, you start to incur a debt, basically your overtraining debt. You start to take away from the gains that you can make. So if we think about our $100 and how we want to spend this during the week, as a new climber, the majority of your $100 should be spent on climbing on the wall because that was where the real growth is going to happen for you. The other stuff that you do off the wall should mainly be there to keep you healthy or to raise your level of work capacity so you can get more out of the climbing that you do on the wall. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the weight room and talk about some of our compound lifts that we'll be using to produce a great strength and fitness stimulus, basically boosting our capacity or work capacity so that we can get more out of our climbing on the wall. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the weight room. Okay, now that it's time to jump into the weight room, let's talk about the exercises that we're going to be picking in the rep schemes that we'll use to increase our strength and work capacity. So if we want to build a strength, we need to be working with heavy loads. So the way that we do that is by picking compound movements. Compound movements are movements that allow us to use multiple muscle groups in multiple joints compared to an isolation movement, which is focused on one target muscle group and one joint. For example, a pull-up compared to a bicep curl. A bicep curl is just utilizing one joint, the elbow joint, whereas a pull-up is using the elbow joint and the shoulder joint, making it a compound movement. So for us as new climbers, especially because we have lower work capacity to begin with, we want to make sure that we're picking exercises that are going to give us a lot of bang for our buck. So we want to spend the resources that we have, that allowance each week on training, on things that are going to help us not only become stronger, but also raise our work capacity. And that is going to be things like compound movements. So these are great for athletic performance in general. So when we're picking compound movements, now we want to think about the rep scheme for these. So rep scheme wise, we're going to pick a rep scheme of between 8 to 12 reps. Traditionally, strength training is done between 3 to 6 reps, and that's because it's allowing you to work with a higher total load. But because we're not going for maximum strength gains here, we really want to focus on just raising our current level of work capacity. We're going to go for a rep scheme of 8 to 12. This is going to allow us to do more work in our sets and get more of a fitness response. We're not going to be limited by the total amount of load that we're using. We're going to be more so limited on either the metabolic response, like the pump, where our heart rate might get up depending on how heavy we're going with certain compound lifts. For example, doing a set of 12 reps for an RDL compared to a set of 3 reps, our heart rate is going to get a lot higher. So ultimately, we're building muscular capacity and fitness beyond just strength when we're doing these higher reps as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the first few exercises here. Okay, the first movement we're going to be talking about is the RDL. This is our hip hinge pattern instead of our squat pattern. A hip hinge is going to preference our glutes and hamstrings over our quads. So we're going to be doing this first, and then we'll squat afterwards to give our quads a little bit more of a focus. So let's go ahead and break this down so we can do this one properly. We're going to go ahead and work with a dumbbell for this, but you can work with a barbell or other things if you need additional load. But for now, we'll just keep it simple and work with a dumbbell. The idea here is to get into a bottom position where your shins are perpendicular to the floor, straight up and down vertical, and then your chest is parallel to the ground, so horizontal. So this is going to allow us to get into a position where our glutes and hamstrings are kind of maximally stretched before we need to reach beyond that and kind of begin to stretch our low back, which we don't necessarily want to do for this. So next up to talk about is how we're going to tip our pelvis to, again, stretch our hamstrings a little bit more. So let me get down into this position here and kind of show you what this looks like. So in this position here, when I have my pelvis tucked underneath me, I'm basically shortening the distance between my glute or the attachment point where my hamstring connects here and down here. Whereas instead we want to make sure that we're stretching those under load. So I'm actually going to tip my pelvis the other way. Think about kind of pulling your tailbone away from you and stretching it to the wall behind you. A really simple cue for this is like if you had a flashlight in your butt, to shine that flashlight at the wall behind you during this movement. So that's going to help us, again, stretch our hamstrings and our glutes rather than squatting down and loading our quads. So if we're doing a proper RDL, we want to make sure that it's a hinge pattern and not a squat pattern. So let's go ahead and jump into this first movement here. Okay, so just again as a final reminder here, the position that we're looking for is our chest is going to be parallel to the floor and our shins are going to be perpendicular to the floor or vertical. So again, in that position, we're preferencing the stretch in our hamstrings and our glutes, which is absolutely what we want in this hinge or this RDL position. So let's go ahead and jump into the elevated heel squat now, which is going to preference the quads. Okay, next up is the elevated heel squat. You can do this off of the edge of a lifting platform if your gym has this, or you can just stand on a classic weight plate or use a heel wedge if your gym has something like that. But the idea here is we're going to use elevated heel position to allow us into a deeper range of motion. If you can do a full range of motion squat where your hamstrings and your calves touch without the need of heel assistance, go ahead and continue to do that. But if you're somebody who can't get into that position without elevating your heels, that's why we elevate the heels. The idea here, again, is to drive our knees way out far over our toes. That's going to allow us to stretch our quads and preference our quads in this lift. We're also going to use our glutes in this lift, but we're kind of taking the hamstrings out of it compared to the RDL, where that is the primary focus. So here, again, we're going to have our chest perpendicular to the floor rather than parallel like in the RDL, again, allowing us to drive our knees way over our toes. So let's go ahead and try a few of these out. Okay, if the unloaded variation was too easy for you, you can think about adding some load by doing a goblet squat variation. Here, we're challenged in the front rack position, which is an amazing way to build core strength as well. So let's go ahead and try a few of these out. Okay, we just wrapped up the RDL and the squat. If you want to dive into those things deeper in detail, I actually have a barbell basics course covering those and a few other essential lifts with a barbell much more in detail. It's about an hour long, so definitely check that course out. Next up, we're going to go through a pull-up here. I'm not going to spend too much time on this movement. It's something that we can talk about more in detail if you want to. The main thing that I want to mention here, though, is that we already do so much vertical pulling in our training that it's not always a great strategy to add more of that into your training off the wall. Again, we want to think about how we're spending that $100, and if we already spent so much of that money doing this on the wall already, it's probably a better idea to get some other variety into our training, something like a horizontal pull variation, which we'll do after the pull-up. But with that being said, let's go ahead and try a couple of these out because it's such an amazing compound movement for climbers. Okay, next up is our horizontal row variation. This is going to be a low row. So instead of pulling it into this high plane here, which is still horizontal pulling, we're actually pulled down to our hip crease. This is going to preference our lat, a much larger muscle group then pulling into this high position here, which is going to be a little bit more of our scaps and some of those other muscles in our upper back and behind our shoulder blades. So with that being said, let's go ahead and set up in a position here where we're hinged at the hip, much like an RDL. So a little bit of this load is going to be loaded into our hamstrings and glutes, but mainly we should be focused on stretching our lats forward and then pulling again back to our hip crease. So let's go ahead and try a few of these out. Okay, next up we have our vertical press variation after we did our horizontal press as the deficit push-up. So here I'm going to go ahead and do a rack-assisted single arm shoulder press. The reason I grab onto a rack for this one is to take stability out of the question here. When we have more stability, we have more ability to produce force. So as this is a unilateral movement, meaning one side, I'm going to be challenged to stabilize that more than I would if I was doing both sides. So in order to get rid of that as a part of the equation, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto the rack to create a more stable position. So let's go ahead and try a few of these out. Okay, so far we've covered 2 lower body movements, our RDL and our elevated heel squat. We covered 2 pull variations, our vertical pull, a pull up, and then our horizontal pull, the low cable row. And then we covered 2 press variations. We have our horizontal press, which is our deficit push up through a full range of motion. And then we have our vertical press variation, which is our single arm dumbbell press that's rack assisted. So with all that being said, the last thing to do is going to be some core. So I don't think there's a better exercise to do than toes to bar. This can be super challenging though. So I think a good place to start for this, a regression of toes to bar, is just going to be knee tucks, basically hanging knee tucks. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what the toes to bar looks like, and then show you what the hanging knee tucks looks like as well. And then we'll do a couple other core exercises to wrap everything up. Okay, now that we've challenged our core through a full range of motion with our toes to bar or our hanging knee tucks, it's time to jump into some isometric holds to build our work capacity and our core's stabilizing muscles. So first and foremost, we're going to do a Copenhagen Plank. This has to be one of my favorite isometric holds for the core because it also targets the inner thigh muscles, the muscles responsible for driving your feet down through holds and creating tension on the wall. So let's go ahead and try this variation out. If this movement is too hard to do at this extended position, go ahead and just scooch down the bench so you have more of your leg supported. When we do that and then press up into position, it's a lot easier compared to if we go into this full extended position here and try to drive our leg down through the bench. So go ahead and try a few of these out. Okay, next up is the hollow body hold. I absolutely love this movement because of how it trains your core to compress and maintain tension from the top of your body to the bottom. So let's go ahead and try this out on a bench so that you can see how my low back is lifting off of the pad in order to create that challenge in this movement. Okay, the last core exercise that we're going to do here is also going to help us build some resilience in our hip muscles. So something really important for us in climbing. So in the Copenhagen Plank, we challenge the muscles on the inside of our leg or our hip. Now we're going to challenge the muscles on the outside of our leg. So this is going to be a kneeling side plank. So similar to the Copenhagen, but instead we're going to challenge those muscles on the outsides of the leg to support us up into position. So let's go ahead and try this one out too. Okay, before we wrap up chapter 5 here, there are a few last things that I want to mention as it relates to your work capacity or the way that you spend your allowance each week in training. So as a new climber, it's important to think about how you're spending that limited allowance that you have, the limited work capacity, in creating an adaptive or a progressive stimulus for you as a new climber. Again, the majority of the work that you do should be on the wall because that's where all the learning and skill acquisition happens as well. So that's a great place to start. If you do have additional resources to spend in the weight room, we want to think about creating a different stimulus than we did on the wall. So likely on the wall, you're going to limit because that's what a lot of new climbers do, and that's okay. But we don't want to do that exact same thing in terms of intensity when we jump into the weight room because we'll quickly run up to that edge of maximum recoverable volume because you have a low work capacity. So in order to avoid or mitigate overtraining injuries, we want to think about producing a different stimulus in the weight room. To do this, we're going to think about doing something that's going to allow us to build our work capacity in the gym rather than max strength because we're already kind of doing that on the wall, so we don't want to do that again in the weight room. So to build our work capacity in the weight room, as we talked about earlier, we're going to be focusing on a few things. First and foremost is compound movements. This is multiple muscle groups and multiple joints allowing us to work with substantial loads. From there, we're going to pick a rep scheme that is going to focus more on muscular endurance or work capacity rather than max strength. So to do that, we're going to go for a rep scheme of 8 to 12 rather than 3 to 8. 3 to 8 is going to be a little bit more of that strength stimulus, focusing on the neurological adaptations, whereas 8 to 12 is going to be a little bit more on the metabolic side of things. So we're going to fight a pump in that rather than trying to produce a maximum force stimulus. So this is going to be great, again, for increasing your work capacity as a new climber, which is really, really essential for allowing you to do more moves on the wall, which is ultimately what actually makes you better as a new climber. So all these things that we do in the weight room should help us increase either our work capacity or strength to then apply to the wall. We don't want to spend a lot of our time in the weight room detracting from our ability to either produce force or spend more allowance on the wall. So with all that being said, I think the best thing for you to do as a new climber is, again, focus on spending that allowance on the wall strategically, either through high intensity sessions that are limited so you're not overdoing it or overcooking yourself. And then the rest of your sessions on the wall should be focused on technical proficiency. So those might be a little bit less intensity and a little bit more volume. And then again, if you do have additional resources to spend in the weight room, think about work capacity things. So rep scheme 8 to 12, multiple muscle group movements, you should be really good from there. If you do decide to jump onto a hangboard, I'd recommend staying away from max hangs to begin because you're already producing that stimulus on the wall. We can talk about how to introduce a hangboard later in, but for now, I think if you do some off-the-wall training, it should mainly be compound movements working with load in the weight room rather than on a hangboard because you're already training your fingers so much on the wall. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 6.